Okay, so we're going to look today at language part 2. Oops. Language was given to man to disguise his thoughts. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is this idea of problematic meaning. So when we think about how language is actually used, okay, it's tricky, as we just saw, how to pinpoint the exact meaning. Okay? So there are lots of non-literal ways that language is used. So I'm going to look at 5 problematic meanings that are used in everyday language. The first one is vagueness. We talked a little bit about this last time, but some words are intentionally vague, like fast, slow. You remember in the activity I did with you guys last time, I had you describe how far away from school, or a lot of money, or stuff like that. Those are vague words, and they have different meanings, right? So like, for example, the word fast would mean something very different to the person who won the Boston Marathon a couple days ago, to someone who, say, drives a race car, or, say, flies a jet plane. To them, when you say the word fast, it probably has a whole different meaning to, say, someone, again, who runs marathons versus someone who flies a plane. So these words are vague, but they are useful to you, okay? Even though they don't pinpoint an exact sort of value, they at least point you in the right direction, okay? So let's use the word bald, for example, okay? Can someone be bald? Okay? Is there any teachers on staff here who are bald? Sure. Now, to you, does bald mean they have absolutely no hair on their head? Is that your definition of bald? Could be. But a lot of people will often say they're bald, and yet they still have a little bit of hair. Or maybe a little more hair. At what point does one person become bald, right? Is there a point where they're not bald, and now they are bald? Is it when one hair fell out, that one last hair they were hanging on to, so that they wouldn't be bald? Of course not. We use bald as sort of a general term, a vague term, to describe sort of a state. So some men are balder than others, but it's kind of impossible to say this is where baldness begins and ends. It's a vague word, okay? Other words are not vague, right? Like if I said a pencil's 4 centimeters long, that's not vague. That's very specific, and it's very easy to pinpoint preciseness out of that. But just because vague words exist doesn't mean they're not useful. They are. But they do tend to create sort of a generalized feeling that some of us aren't talking about the same thing. Okay, the second thing is ambiguity. Okay? The Duchess cannot bear children. Could mean that she cannot have children. She cannot give birth to children. Or it could mean she can't stand children. She just cannot take children. She doesn't like them. That sentence does not give you enough information to resolve the ambiguity of it. We don't know what's going on necessarily in that sentence. When someone speaks it, they might add tone or intonation that might help clarify the ambiguity, but when we read that sentence, we don't know. So ambiguity, another example, the author lives with his wife, an architect, and an amateur musician in Brandon. Now what that could mean is that his wife is an architect, and his wife is also an amateur musician, and they live in Brandon, him and his wife. But it could also mean that there are actually 3 people. The author, his wife, an architect, and an amateur musician. Again, the vagueness and the ambiguity of that sentence, not the vagueness, but the ambiguity there, kind of intentionally misleads people. Yes? You think it's this? You think it's that it's not ambiguous? Ambiguous? Yeah. Oh, okay. So the author lives with his wife and architect. Okay. So you're saying it couldn't be 2 people? So his wife has to be an architect according to the structure?
So his wife.
Yeah.
And then another person is a list.
It could be. But commas can also be, what if I had an architect in brackets, not in comma? What if I said his wife, bracket, an architect? and an amateur musician. Right? Instead of commas. Do you think would that change it a bit? It's kind of like the activity we did, right? It depends, right? There's a lot going on there. I accept your point. Absolutely, it could be. And the reality is, ambiguity is often used intentionally to mislead people, especially by people like politicians. I'm opposed to taxes which damage incentives. Could mean you're opposed to all taxes because all taxes damage incentives. Or does it mean you are only opposed to specific taxes which are the ones that damage incentives? A politician might intentionally say something very ambiguous like that, so that later when they're challenged on it, they can go, well, that's not what I meant. What I meant was this. I meant the other part of that. So sometimes people will use these things that are problems in language to their advantage. Okay. Context can help with this. Sometimes if we read more than just the one sentence, it makes more sense. So here, for example, they saw Mrs. Jones and the dog sitting under the table. Now, how are you going to interpret that sentence? Are you going to imagine you see Mrs. Jones and there's a dog under a table? Or is Mrs. Jones and the dog under the table? Are both of them under the table? Most likely, based on the context of that sentence, it's very unlikely that Mrs. Jones is under a table with her dog. It's possible people would sit under a table with their dogs, but it's more likely that it's just the dog that's under the table. So when reading that sentence, if say we were reading it in a novel, we would most likely just accept the fact that it was just the dog under the table, because people don't usually sit under tables with dogs. But again, it's intentionally ambiguous, and so it could be misinterpreted there. Maybe the writer meant to, maybe it was an important piece that both of them were under the table. It's hard to say, right? Okay, the third thing that's problematic is secondary meanings. So as we talked about last time, words have a primary meaning, a denotation, a so-called dictionary definition, but a lot of words also have a secondary meaning or a connotation, okay? The connotation is what we associate the word with. It's not the dictionary definition, but it's like what the word sort of conjures up in its connotative form. So here's some examples. Love, death, school, religion. They have dictionary definitions, but they might have different connotations for different people. As well, we tend to use things like euphemisms this way. So for example, we use the term passed away. Passed away is a euphemism for death, for dying. But we tend to prefer to use words like passed away rather than use the word died. Why? Why do we do that? Why don't we just say, oh, he died, right? What do you think? It's not as harsh. Yeah, it's more palatable to hear. But if you looked up the dictionary definition of passed away, and actually looked at the way those words are defined, that's not its definition. That's not its denotation. What we're using is its connotation. What does this connotate, right? If you looked it up, passed away, it's like the act of passing, and away means away from somebody. That's not going to help you understand what passed away means, right? Can you think of other euphemisms we use to soften the blow rather than actually use the dictionary definition? Yeah, let go. We let him go instead of we fired him. Okay? Now again, if you looked up the dictionary definition of let go, you might imagine that he was like hanging on to him and he just let him go, right? Now let's not get too vulgar or anything like that, but what about like say bathroom things, right? We tend to use, now I'm going to be talking about farting now. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm going to be talking about farting. That's right. That's right, other teachers. I'm talking about farting in here. My grandmother didn't like that word. She's still alive. She's 96. She would always say, oh, did you make a whoopsie? That's what she used to say to me. And that was her connotation for that act, because she felt it was a different word. Now again, you guys could probably think of different connotative, slangish type words that don't mean literally what you're saying, but they are used as a euphemism. for things like sexual acts, right? Like things like, like say you were reading this novel and it said, Sally and John had a beautiful wedding, and that night, on their wedding night, they made love, right? Well, if you were, say, coming from another culture and you were kind of trying to understand this, and you looked up made and love, you might be really confused as to what was going on. Rather than if the novel said, on their wedding night they had sexual intercourse, right? That's not necessarily written into the novel. Yes, I said it loud through a microphone. But you get the idea, right? Is that we often use that connotation for a variety of reasons. Now, as a matter of fact, this also relates to the next piece. Well, let me just jump back for a second. Sometimes we tend to use the euphemism even more so than the dictionary definition, that it just becomes so popular that that's the only way we use it. Now, I'll get back to that in a second. The next thing is metaphor, okay? We use things metaphorically. Miranda had her head in the clouds. Marvin is a pillar of the community. Agnes had put her roots down in Canada. Now, metaphor is often something really difficult for people who come from other cultures to grasp. Because metaphors, which exist in other cultures, don't always necessarily exist in the same way. Right? So say you were in Canada for the first time and you just learned English, and you read this sentence, Agnes had put her roots down in Canada. You might be thinking to yourself as you read this, oh my God, does this lady have like a mutation? She has roots coming out of her body? How does this work? Marvin is a pillar of the community. Do these Canadians actually name their pillars? And why are their communities on pillars? What kind of, is this some sort of flood zone where they have to put their land up on pillars? And why do they name them? I don't get it, right? Of course not. This is a metaphor, right? It's a metaphor being used to create a feeling, to create sort of an expression there, a metaphorical expression. So let's take a look at two sentences. My brother is a butcher. My dentist is a butcher. One of these is metaphorical. Which one would you guess did I mean metaphorically? The second one? Yeah. You probably took the first one literally. Oh, Walks probably has a brother. He's a robust-looking fella. So the fact that he's a butcher kind of makes sense. Probably has a brother. I don't, by the way. I don't have any brothers. But the second one, you'd probably interpret metaphorically. Because you'd probably think to yourself, well, he's already a dentist. Why would he need to be a butcher as well? What they probably mean by that is he's a really bad dentist, and we're calling him a butcher because he hacks and slashes at your mouth, and that's a metaphor going on there. But it's entirely possible that I actually meant them in the reverse order. That the first one I meant metaphorically, and the second one I meant literally. Again, an easy way to have a problem with the meaning of the context going on there. Okay. Now, there are metaphors that are now what are called dead metaphors. So for example, nightfall, sharp tongue, brilliant mind, chair leg, in love. They're called dead metaphors because at one time, it metaphorically meant something. But it became the practice that we kept saying the metaphor so many times that now we know what it means without actually understanding what the metaphor was. So for example, why is it called nightfall? Do you know? Darkness falling across the sky. Maybe. But are you sure? No, I'm not either. That's a good hypothesis. I like it. But it's become so commonly used that we don't really even know what the metaphor really was anymore. Sharp tongue. Where did that one come from? I don't know. Did someone at one time actually sharpen a tongue? Is it meaning literally? No. Is it some sort of metaphor? I don't know. What about rule of thumb? You ever guys heard that expression? It's a rule of thumb. Anyone know where that came from? That was a metaphor used because it's pretty nasty. At one time there was an actual rule that you couldn't beat your wife with a stick that was thicker than your thumb. I believe that's where that metaphor came from. That's horrible. But that's where the metaphor came from. And we just now use the metaphor all the time, that the actual meaning behind it is dead. We are just used to the metaphor now. That's hugely confusing to people. Yesterday I asked someone in the other class, I said, someone who speaks another language or comes from another culture. And one of the students came from China, and he said, well, in China, when someone's smart, we call them a fox. That's sort of a metaphor they use in China. Say, he's smart as a fox, or he's a fox. And I said, you know what, if you use that metaphor in Canada, he's a fox, people might interpret it differently. They may not think he's a smart fella, right? They might think, and some of the other class said, oh, well, it probably means that he's sly. And then the girls in the class said, whoa, we actually have a whole different sort of, when we hear the word he's a fox, it's more of a appearance thing. He's a good-looking guy, right? So these metaphors can be incredibly problematic for what they actually mean. Okay, the final one I want to look at is irony. Now, irony is a really interesting one. Every single culture that exists on the earth, or has ever existed on the earth, has had some examples of irony in their language. Think about that. What is irony? Irony is you mean the exact opposite of what you're saying. Instead of meaning X, you mean not X. So today, when you're at lunch and someone's walking through the cafeteria with their food, and they drop it, they go, whoa, and they drop all their food. And someone says, hey, good job, buddy. Is that what they meant? They mean, wow, that was actually a really good job you did dropping those dishes. Of course not. They meant the complete opposite of that. They mean the exact opposite of what they just said. And that's what irony is, right? Every culture has that. So think about that. Say you guys were right now transported to some other culture that speaks a totally different language. I don't even want to name it. Let's say it's just, they're like culture X. And they use their language. Now you kind of have a translator book so you can sort of help learn it. And they say to you, wow, you're a really good-looking Canadian. You'd be like, whoa, look at this. I love these people. They think, but they were being ironic, maybe. They were saying it ironically. How could you know, right? Irony is actually one of the hardest things people who learn English or learn another language have trouble with. Because why wouldn't you have trouble? They're saying it, but they mean the exact opposite. Really hard to grasp, right? So this is a huge problem with language. If they're employing irony, wow, how are we ever going to figure that out? So if you think about all those things together, right? Ambiguity, vagueness, irony, metaphor. How the heck do we even understand one another with all this stuff going on? It adds a lot of problem to our meaning. Almost all education is language education. That's a pretty big, I should never put that up in front of Mr. McWilliam. He'll get a very bigger head if I do that. Okay, so let's look at meaning and interpretation. So we get this idea, language is tricky because of those things like vagueness and secondary meanings, etc. Okay? So it implies that with language, it's not just about saying it, but we have to kind of dissect it. We have to kind of decode what's being said to us or what we're reading. We have to interpret language. That's kind of assumed, that you're hearing me now, but you have to kind of decode what I'm saying. Now there's rules that help with the decoding, like grammar and syntax and stuff like that. And you can make words mean whatever you like, okay? The rules are kind of loose, you can reinterpret them. So it's tough, right? So rather than thinking of meaning as this all or nothing thing, it kind of makes sense to think of it as levels of meaning. So here's an example. If I throw out the words theory of relativity to, say, a grade 8 classroom, the grade 8 classroom will probably have a general idea what I'm talking about when I say theory of relativity. Some of them may have heard it before. Some of them may have studied it in their science class a little bit. But if I throw out the words theory of relativity to Mr. Libby upstairs, he will most likely have a deeper level of meaning for those words than the grade 8 students. I think we could agree on that, okay? And I think, for example, you guys might consider yourselves to have deeper meanings in certain areas, right? Like like say one of you is a professional or a swimmer. You do a lot of swimming. You do a lot of competitions and stuff. If I talk about, say, elementary backstroke. As me, my meaning is based on what my daughter tells me when she comes back from swimming lessons. I don't have a lot of meaning to that other than some kind of swimming thing, and she's on her back. But for you, who maybe have studied swimming and have learned it, you really have a deeper meaning there. So maybe that's a way we should look at meaning, is that there's kind of levels of it. In some cases, I kind of understand up here, and in other points, I have a really deep understanding of the words. Okay, so I'm going to wrap with this today, which I know some of you are thinking right now in all my TOK presentations. Walks, why should I even care about this? What does this matter? Just wrap it up. Why does it matter? Is this important? Is this TOK stuff actually got an actual, is there anything consequence to this? Well, I'm going to argue that there is. For example, in court cases, okay? The difference between the word murder and the word manslaughter are really important in a court case. Does anyone know what is the difference between those? Alex? So murder is purposeful and manslaughter is accidental. Is the consequence of being found guilty of one or those different, do you think? So if you're found guilty of murder, do you think it's more extreme than manslaughter? Yeah. So I would think that the importance in the way those words are defined in a courtroom is literally a matter of life and death. Right? It's literally really, really important. So yeah, I think this is important. Think about politicians. Think about teachers. Think about advertisers. Think about people who are selling you things, offering you ideas based on the meaning of words. For example, let's say this happens. Let's say poverty rates in Canada are going up. Let's say they're going up in Winnipeg. Poverty rates are going up. Politicians look at that and they go, oh, this isn't good. I'm not going to get reelected if the public finds out the poverty rates are going up. How about we change the definition of poverty? So right now, this is the definition of poverty, and we're using statistics based on that. Let's change the definition. So right now we have poverty defined as, you only earn this amount of money, and you only have this much in savings. How about we change the definition to now mean this? Look, the poverty rate isn't so bad anymore. That actually happens. Politicians actually do that. They actually change the definition of words for purposes, for agendas. So I'd argue that that's important about the meaning of words, is that there's that kind of consequence going on there. Okay, so I want you to read this. I'm going to put up a horoscope for you guys. You know what a horoscope are? This is a horoscope. Please read that to yourself right now. Okay, everyone got that? The reality is when I show this horoscope to groups of people and do statistics on it and ask them, do you feel that this horoscope relates to you? You know what happens? The majority of people rate that horoscope as either good or excellent in how it describes them. Okay? And there's a reason for that. The reason is it's intentionally made vague and general, so that of course you can derive some sort of meaning out of it. It was intentionally written that way so that everyone thinks it's about them, when in reality it's about everybody, right? I mean, let me go back and look at some of the things. It says, at times you're extroverted and social, while at other times you're introverted. Well, now I just said you could be either, right? Say, well, one time you're here, one time you're there. Well, of course that's going to apply to everybody, right? You could go, well, yeah, I think very few of us would say, I'm extrovert all the time, or I'm an introvert all the time. So it's intentionally written that way, okay? And that's the way horoscopes in general are written. Go ahead and look them in the newspaper or look them up online, and you'll start to see, or things like fortune cookie messages. They are often very vague, Okay? They employ, for example, a lot of those 5 elements that we looked at before, vagueness, problematic meanings and stuff. Okay, now, everything in this presentation has been about one language, English. There is approximately 3,000 active languages in the world right now, and that number, by the way, is going down. Okay? It is probably at its lowest level in world history. Why do you think that is? Why do you think languages are going down? And maybe even more importantly, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Almost turns into a morality question here. Is English the most commonly used language? Is it English that people are learning? That, I think we have a bias there because I'm speaking English right now. What do you think, Jude? Okay. Okay. So you think that's what's causing the number to go down?
Yeah, so if a language...
So some languages showing more useful than others, right? In terms of like more words and more sort of stuff like that.
If one language is like 200 years old...
Oh, and its longevity. What do you think? What the reason? Right. Oh, okay. So there's less sort of transmitting of the language generation to generation. It's kind of fading away, so to speak. I agree with everything you guys have said. I also think, and again, I don't have an answer for you guys. This is just speculation. I also think it's part of the fact that now in the modern world, it's easier to communicate with other cultures than it was before. So you may have had this culture, say in the African continent, that had their language, and they didn't communicate outside that culture ever, right? Like generation after generation passed, and they rarely had contact with other cultures. So their language stayed strong within that culture. But now they can go on the internet and they want to watch a YouTube video, and it's in English. They might think, well, maybe I should learn English so I can understand what this YouTube video is. So the fact that the sort of communication across the world is growing might be actually bringing the number of languages down because now people want to access those, and then all the other features you guys said would be the case. Again, I don't know. But the second question, do you guys think that's a good thing? Or do you think it's a bad thing that the number of languages is going down? You think it's a bad thing? Yeah. Yeah, and I don't want to pass judgment on you guys. I think both are valid answers for different reasons. I think some could say it's a good thing that it's going down because maybe then we can all communicate with each other. Some, I would say, have a valid answer by saying it's a bad thing because we're losing that piece of culture in the world, right? There could be languages that are disappearing forever. That's kind of sad, right? Okay, that's it for today, everybody.